30,000 of your best soldiers and set them in an ambush against the city of Ai. So he tells them to get back behind the city where they can't really see you, and I want you out there. Now he sends them out at night, so they can't see the movement. So now you can think, here's Ai, here's the city, and back behind it, there's 30,000 men hiding. Now next, Jacob takes the remaining army and sets them up camp north of the city. There's a valley between the city and where he's camped, but he wants to make sure they can see him. Joshua wants to make sure that the city of Ai and the king of Ai sees him sitting there. So Ai, by the way, also had an ally in the city-state of Bethel. And Joshua was concerned about Bethel that may send some troops to fight along Ai because had an agreement. Therefore, he positions another 5,000 troops behind Ai and Bethel to ambush Bethel's army if they decide to attack. So that night, Joshua moves his remaining army into the valley. So now we see this plan unfold, how it works out. The king of Ai gets up in the morning and sees all these Israelites in the valley. And he decides to attack. Now, one thing we do not know how many Israeli troops were in the valley. It doesn't say. I would have to assume it was about 3,000. The reason I make that assumption, and again, this is only assumption because the Bible doesn't say, because that was the same number that he originally sent out to defeat Ai. So when this king sees, oh, there's only 3,000 of them, I think we can take them again. So now the king of Ai, he's confident he can win. So he gets out, leaves the city, and starts to attack. And guess what? As soon as he starts to attack, Joshua and the army, what do? Did they go forward and attack? No, they turn and run. Just like they did before. And Ai, the king of Ai, says, we got him again. He's so excited. He calls out and he says, hey, all the remaining men in the city, come with me. The army of Bethel, come join me. We're going to just kick these guys one last time, and we're not going to have a problem with them. Well, he had one problem. He forgot to shut the gate. They left in such a hurry. They left the city gate open. And then, I can imagine at this point, in a Charleston Heston moment. Now, do y'all remember Charleston Heston? Now, he was Moses, right? He wasn't Joshua. But what did he do? He held it as staff, and the Red Sea parted. Well, now Joshua holds out his javelin. Because now these guys they're on the run. But he stops and holds out his javelin. And guess what? The 30,000 troops that were behind Ai see that javelin. They rush and they go into the city gates because it's open. They start the place on fire. They start burning the town of Ai. So suddenly, the king of Ai and his people turn around and look. Uh-oh, there's smoke coming out of the city. So he says, they say, we got to go back. All of a sudden, they're sitting there facing 30,000 troops coming at them, and he turns the other direction. Here's these 3,000 or so coming up, and here's another 5,000 coming in. So there's, there's probably about 38,000 troops against his small number. There's only 12,000 men, women, and children all in all of Ai. And so what happens? They slaughter them. God has said, these are evil people. They are to be removed. This is God's judgment against their evilness. Every one of them are killed. But this time, after this burning the city, they're able to come out with the plunder and the cows and all that stuff. They got all this for themselves this time. And Joshua had the king of Ai actually impaled on a pole and left there until sunset. And I don't know exactly how he impaled him on a pole, but I remember you all heard the story of Dracula. Well, there was actually a Count Dracula, I think his name was, if I'm not mistaken. He would impale people on this pole. So here's a pole, and here's people sitting like this on top of it. It was a pretty gruesome sight, and I think he was trying to make a statement. If you oppose us, this is your. So at sunset, he takes the king, he throws him out the city gate, and he piles a big pile of rocks on it. And when Joshua wrote the book of Joshua, it said those pile of rocks are still there. So far, Israel's experience is an illustration of their whole history. And unfortunately, the spiritual history of many Christians. What happens is they're obedient, and when they're obedient, what? They have victory. Following victory is a blessing. They're blessed. But guess what happens after their blessing, after they're blessed? It's followed by pride and disobedience. What happens when they pride and disobedient? It leads to defeat. Defeat is followed by judgment. Judgment is followed by repentance. Repentance is followed with obedience. Obedience by victory. And guess what? The cycle continues. We'll see this pattern all throughout the book of Judges, where they turn to God. Everything's working great. They turn away from God. We don't need God anymore. Disaster strikes them. Now, this chapter finishes with Joshua following Moses' commands that were found in Deuteronomy 27 and 28. I'm not going to tell you to turn there. But what happened is Moses told them, when you come into the land, you're supposed to go to Mount Ebal, and you're supposed to build a altar there. And this altar is made of uncut stone. And on these stones, the law is written on this altar, on these stones that are make up the altar. And after that, the law is read to all Israelites. I mean, it was a kind of like commemorating what God has done for them. They've made it. This was kind of like we're here. And this was probably as a very religious point, but it was also a celebration of what had happened, that God finally led them into the promised land. Now let's turn over to chapter 9. And once again, we will see where Joshua and the Israelite leaders failed to consult God, and it cost them. Now, following God's defeat of Jericho and Ai, all the kings east of the Jordan River said, you know what? We need to join together. We need to join together if we're going to fight Joshua and Israel. Because you understand, there were a lot of people. I mean, when they came out of Egypt, there were 600,000 men, women, and children that came out of Egypt. So I don't know, all we hear about in this army is about 30-some-odd thousand men, but, most of these were city-states. They didn't have armies that big. I mean, they weren't that huge of cities. But not all the kings decided to join in that alliance. There was one king called Gibeon, and they chose an entirely different path. The Gibeons knew they could not defeat Israel, so they devised a plan of deception. So what was that plan? Well, if you look at verses in chapter 9, if you look at verses 3 through 6, it says, however, when the people of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they resorted to a ruse. They went as a delegation whose donkeys were loaded with worn-out sacks and old wineskins, cracked and mended. They wore and patched sandals on their feet and wore old clothes. All the bread of their food supply was dry and moldy. Then they went to Joshua in the camp of Gilead and said to him and the Israelites, we have come from a distant country. Make a treaty with us. Well, first of all, in Exodus 23, 23, and 24, they were forbidden to make a treaty with anybody in Canaan. God's command was, you wipe them out. They're evil people, and guess what? If you leave them there, what's going to happen? You'll become evil. So they were not supposed to make any kind of, So when they were challenged, so Joshua kind of comes up and says, where are you guys really from? He said, I don't know if he really believed him, but what he didn't do, right? He didn't ask God. So what happens, it says in verses 9 through 13, they answered, your servants had come from a very distant country because of the fame of the Lord your God. For we have heard reports of him, all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites east of Jordan, Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who reigns in Ashdod. And our elders and all those living in our country said to us, take provisions for your journey, go and meet them. We are your servants. Make a treaty with us. The bread of ours was warm when we packed it at home on the day we left to come to you. But now you can see it is dry and moldy. It is. And these wrinkles and these wineskins that we filled with were new, but now you can see they're cracked, and our clothes and sandals are worn out by this very long journey. So again, as I mentioned, Joshua and them make a very critical problem. As I said, they do not seek God. They examine the provisions and said, this looks like these guys must have come from a long ways. So they made a treaty with them. A few days later, they learned that the Gibeonites are actually their neighbors. but because of the treaty, they swore to God that they would not harm them. And when you swear to God, you better upkeep it. You better keep that. So they could not have attacked them. Now, the rank and file were pretty upset about that. They said they grumbled because the leaders had made this treaty. But the leaders told them, we have given them our oath by the Lord, the God of Israel. We cannot touch them now. This is what we will do. We will let them live so that God's wrath will not fall on us for breaking the oath we swore to them. They continued, let them live, but let them be the woodcutters and the water carriers in the service of the whole assembly. So the leaders promised to keep them. So they became servants, but at least they were spared. You know, if you had a choice of becoming a servant or dying, what would you probably choose to be a servant? So Joshua asked the Gibeonites, so why did you deceive us? They gave this answer. Your servants were clearly told how the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you the whole land and to wipe out all its inhabitants from before you. So we feared for our lives because of you, and that is why we did this. You know, you think about it, these guys had no question, these Gibeonites, they were not believers. They had no question, though, what would happen to them. They fully believed God would do what he said. They fully believed they would be wiped out. You always think if Israel had had that much faith, if they would have fully believed that God would have conquered all of Canaan, I think they wouldn't have suffered near the problems they face in the future. So how many times do we find this? How many times do we not really believe what God's telling us? You know, how many times is like, I just don't know, God, that can't happen. But guess what? He's God. Anything can happen. Everything can happen with God. So now they have these problems. They have these Gibeonites that they have made them servants, but they've already broken a covenant. One of the things they had promised to God they would not do. So let's look over to chapter 10. In verses 1 and 2 it says, Now Adon-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had taken Ai and totally destroyed it, doing to Ai and its king as it had done to Jericho and its king, and that the people of Gibeon had made a treaty of peace with Israel and had become their allies. He and his people were very much alarmed at this because Gibeon was an important city, like one of the royal cities. It was larger than Ai, and all its men were good fighters. So now we see the king of Jerusalem. This guy's scared. If Gibeon wouldn't fight him, who could stand up against him? So he begins to think, what can I do? So he calls his other buddies, his 4 other Ammonite kings, and says, hey, why don't we join forces? You know, because they were afraid to take on God. Because they were afraid of taking on God, they said, you know what, we'll take Gibeon. We'll teach them a lesson, and maybe nobody else will try to make a treaty anymore, because they assumed that it was a military alignment. They figured now if we go attack, Israel, Gideon will join in. They did not know that Gideon had formed a role as a servant in Israel. Now, there's an interesting note in history. How did these Jerusalem leaders know all this? Well, actually, they have found 5 letters written to the Pharaoh regarding Egypt. So Jerusalem said, hey, what happened in Egypt? You know what? And these actually are known as the Armenia letters. So there's actual letters they have found where the leaders in Jerusalem have been talking or been communicating back and forth with Pharaoh regarding the Israelis. Now, the NIV, which I just read, said they were very much alarmed. Now, some versions said they were feared greatly. I like the word feared. Now, the question was, did they retreat from fear? No. They didn't retreat from fear. They were going to attack. Now, we must think about our own lives. We have spiritual enemies we deal with every day. Our question is, do they retreat from us? No. What do? Satan's going to attack you. He's not going to retreat. You know, it's kind of like a wild animal might fight when it feels is attacked. Well, Satan is going to, the closer you to get to God, the more he's going to attack you. And this is what was going to happen here. I think this goes back to David is talking about cultural war. You know, Satan and his forces are not going to lay back in fear, but they're going to attack the basic Christian values all day long. Because he knows the output. So all God can do, as a believers, he can make your life miserable. As non-believers, he can keep you from becoming believing. Now at this point, the 5 kings of southern Canaan attacked Gibeon. Because like I said, they didn't want to attack Israel. They're going to say, we're just going to take out Gibeon. And you know, when they said they camped around them, they were expecting them to like, oh, here's this large force. We'll just surrender. We don't think we can defeat these 4. Or maybe they're going to starve us out. Regardless, apparently some of the Gibeonites escaped and went to Joshua. And they pleaded for Joshua and his leaders to come help them. They said in verse 8, do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us. They did this because of the covenant they had with Israel. You know, as a child of God, we have a new covenant with God. Which started, our journey started with our covenant with God was similar when he says, and changing words, but don't give up on me, please save me. You know, if we call upon the Lord, he will save us. And that's what these Gibeonites were doing. They were calling upon Joshua. And Joshua's God to come save us. Now, while Joshua and his people had made a bad vow to the Gibeonites, they knew they had to honor this vow. Now, just think about it. They made this vow, and this was a bad vow. They did not do what God had told them. What could they have done at this point in time when those guys from Gibeon said, hey, you need to come help us? What they could have done? They could have said, sorry, you're on your own. Well, you know, when you get through the battle, if you live, come bring us some water and wood. No, they didn't do that. They could have done it, but they knew the vow they made would not let them do that. So Joshua felt obligated under this treaty. Therefore, he got his army together to go to fight these 5 kings. Look what God told Joshua in verse 8. The Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid of them. I have given to their hands. Not one of them will be able to withstand you. I mean, this is a pretty common theme. God, what do we do? God says, don't worry about it. I got it under control. Now, how many times in our battles do we not realize that God's always in control? Because even before the battle, he says, hey, you won it. Don't worry about it. You know, think about our own spiritual battles. God tells us not to fear because he has already won the battle. As Joshua took comfort in the Lord, so should we. That we have a God out there that's watching over us. So the Israeli army begins to march at night. And they get to Gibeon. And to get to Gibeon, they have to travel 3,300 feet up over 20 miles. It takes them probably 8 to 10 hours to make this hard. And this is done at night. So, you know, they had to move slow because I'm sure they were stumbling over each other at times. And suddenly they appear to these 5 kingdoms. And the Israelites begin to fight them, begins to slaughter them. But Israel did not fight this fight alone. Now, after marching all night, they mounted their attack immediately. As the 5 kingdoms began to retreat, the Israelis tried to chase them down. But I'm sure they were tired. Now, how were they going to chase these guys down? Well, guess what? They didn't have to worry. God was taking care of this. You'll see in verse 11, it says, as they fled before Israel on the road down from Beth Horon of Azekah, the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them, and more of them died from the hail than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. God commanded the Israelites to fight, but the ultimate victory was not won by military might. It was won by God. Again, he shows Israel, I'm there. I'm in charge. Now, at this point, probably the greatest miracle in the Old Testament time happens. They're running out of daylight. They can't kill them fast enough. It's going to be dark. They're going to escape. So in 12 through 14, it says, on the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on its enemies. As is written in the book of Asher, the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. There had never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. So here Jacob asked God, let the sun stand still. I mean, that's incredible that, this could happen. Now, many scholars try to give example of why this could happen and say, well, the earth fell off its axis and tilted one side. One guy says, well, a comet came real close and knocked it off its rotation for a while. We don't know how that happened. All we know is God made it happen, and that's all we have to know. Now, before we leave these verses, let's look at the words as it is written in the book of Jasher. Has anybody ever heard of that book before? It means upright. It says the book seems to be a collection of Hebrew songs in honor of Israel's leaders and their exploits in battle. And it may have been the same book called the Wars of the Lord, found in Numbers 21 through 14. The book of Asher is mentioned again in 1 Samuel 1:18, and then a portion of the book is actually quoted in the next one from 19 of 27 of 1 Samuel. So if anybody ever gets on a trivia question and asks you about that, you'll know what it means now. So what happened to the 5 kings? Well, first of all, not all the enemy was killed. Some of them did make it back to their fortified cities. In fact, it's interesting to know that Jerusalem never fell to Joshua's people. It remained a city-state the whole time. It wasn't until King David took over, that Jerusalem was finally conquered. Again, this goes back to the fact that the Israelis didn't follow Jesus' total instruction, wiping everybody out. So Jerusalem survived. But anyway, so what happened to these 5 kings? Well, they weren't so lucky. I mean, brave men, they went and hid in the cave, right? So they're in this cave, and they're found out. They're finding out where they're at. So they get this big stone and roll over it, and they post some guards, and he says, hey, keep killing more, of these kingdoms. So after they pretty much wiped out the kings, that, all the soldiers they could catch, Joshua has the 5 kings removed from the cave and brought to him. Now he tells his commanders to come and place their feet on the king's neck, the necks of the kings of East Canaan. So why would he have to do that? Well, it said the gesture symbolized Israelites' victory and promised assurance of future conquest. So at this point, Joshua slays the 5 kings. As he had done with the kings of Ai, he placed them all on poles they could see. Now, he wanted to make sure that there was no accommodations that they would say from the Canaanite kings. Now, believe it or not, that Joshua actually took a big risk in doing this by killing these kings. Apparently, it was a custom then, is when you conquered in this case, there were city-states. If you conquered a city-state, the king was allowed to live. Because they said next time you could be on the losing end, and you would want favor from this king that you let go. Well, Joshua knew if the Israeli armies were ever defeated, he would be killed, because he did not show mercy to any of these kings. Now, before we leave this section, I want you to look at verse 21. It says, the whole army then returned safely to Joshua in the camp of whatever, Macedania. But no one uttered a word against the Israelites. The Canaan people knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God, the only true God, was with Joshua and the nation of Israel. They knew they had no chance. Now, the remainder of the chapter was summed up in verses 40 and 43. It says, so Joshua subdued the whole region, including the hill country, then Nivig and the western foothills and the mountain slopes, together with all their kings. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Joshua subdued them from Kadesh Barnea to Garza, and from the whole region of Goshen to Gibeon. And all these kings and their lands Joshua conquered in one campaign, because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. Then Joshua returned with all the Israel to the camp of Gilgad. Now Joshua and the army defeated all these kings. So how did he do it? He did this because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. So God fights for us on a daily. And we shouldn't fear what Satan can do. We shouldn't fear, because remember, we all have the only true God, the God of Israel, our God our Father. Let's end in a word of prayer. Now, Heavenly Father, we just want to praise your name. We just thank you for being our God, the creator of everything, the only God, a God that we can turn to even though we're just mere pawns in this world. But you're our God that we can talk to. We can offer our petitions. Most of all, we can offer our praise to you. We just ask to be with all these prayer requests that we heard tonight. We ask you that in the healing that you could be with those who are traveling. We ask all these things in your holy name. Amen.